Deep in the mountains of Ork, a remote region of Missouri, there is a story few know and even fewer dare to tell. A world of their own rules was created by families living for generations in isolation, nestled between deep valleys and dense forests so dense they block the sun. It was in 1978 that rural doctor Dr. Robert Lon first documented the case of the Whitaker sisters. Eleanina, Margaret, and Ruth, born between 1932 and 1937, were the daughters of first-degree cousins, who in turn descended from a family line with centuries of marriages between relatives. Dr. Lon wrote in his medical diary, now preserved at the University of Missouri, "When I first visited that property, I noticed something peculiar. Even during the day, the curtains remained closed. I was received by the older brother, Thomas, the only one apparently without visible deformities. What the doctor discovered inside that isolated house would haunt him for the rest of his career. Severe facial deformities afflicted the three sisters: misaligned jaws, asymmetrical eyes, cranial malformations, and extreme dental problems. Even more striking was that they all wore handmade cloth masks, even inside the home, even in the presence of their own family. Eleanina, the oldest, was the one who first removed her mask so I could examine her," said Lon. "The reflection of pain in her eyes when she realized my initial reaction remains with me to this day." That the Whitaker sisters suffered from mandibulofacial dysostosis was revealed by medical analysis, a rare genetic condition usually associated with Treacher-Collins syndrome, but with manifestations made particularly severe due to successive consanguineous marriages. At least 7 generations of weddings among cousins in the family were later confirmed by parish records and local censuses surveyed. The outside world remained ignorant of the sisters' existence until 1983, when a brief mention in a regional medical newspaper caught the scientific community's attention. Any public exposure, however, was consistently refused by the family, who protected the sisters from social scrutiny. The story of the Whitaker sisters is not an isolated case. On the contrary, it represents a broader phenomenon in the isolated rural communities of America, where geographical, cultural, and religious isolation created conditions for consanguineous marriage practices that persisted long after they were widely abandoned elsewhere. Check now if you are already subscribed to this channel. Rarely are cases like the Whitaker sisters documented with such depth, and our research brings to light stories that society prefers to forget. The science behind their conditions must be understood if we are to fully comprehend the drama of women who hid their faces behind masks. Dr. James Warren, a geneticist at the University of Columbia who studied similar cases in 1992, explains, "Consanguinity itself does not create new genetic mutations. What it does is increase the chance that harmful recessive genes, which would usually remain dormant for generations, manifest when the same genetic variant is inherited from both parents." An extraordinary concentration of deleterious recessive alleles was revealed by later genetic analyses in the specific case of the Whitaker sisters, a perfect genetic storm that resulted in the severe deformities that afflicted them. That the incidence of congenital defects in this region was 47% higher than the national average between 1920 and 1970 is shown by the medical records of Shannon County, Missouri, preserved in the State Historic Archive. Clusters of congenital malformations in specific families were documented in a 1965 public health report that remained classified for decades due to concerns about stigmatizing the community. The communities of the Ork Mountains have developed a triple isolation, explains anthropologist Dr. Sarah Mackenzie, who has studied the region for 2 decades. First, the geographic insulation with rugged terrain and precarious roads. Second, cultural isolation with a deep distrust of outsiders. Third, genetic isolation with a limited group of potential partners. This isolation was not accidental. That many of these families deliberately fled the scrutiny of wider society is shown by historical records. The Whitakers, for example, were descendants of settlers who chose remote lands in the 1830s to avoid religious persecution. Marriage practices that favored unions within the same family circle were developed by the community, often justified by particular religious interpretations and the need to keep the land within the family. Marriages between cousins as blessed by the Lord to maintain the purity of the lineage are defended in local church documents dated 1875 by a local pastor. When Eleanina Whitaker was 20 years old in 1952, An itinerant doctor offered surgical treatment to alleviate her deformities. The family refused. According to Dr. Lon's report, they saw the girl's condition not as a disease but as a divine trial to be supported with dignity. A practical solution emerged in the masks. Initially made by the girl's mother and later by themselves, the masks were carefully sewn from dark fabrics, covering most of the face with openings only for the eyes. That the masks were surprisingly elaborate is shown by rare photographs preserved in Dr. Lon's medical archive, with embroidered details that suggested an idealized face. The paradoxical tragedy is that the same isolation that contributed to their condition also protected them from the cruel social scrutiny they would certainly have faced in the outside world. Fragments of their extraordinary lives were revealed by the Whitaker sisters in the few interviews given to Dr. Lon between 1978 and 1985, gathered in his confidential medical archive and partially released for research in 2010. Margaret, the middle sister, described her daily routine. "We woke up before dawn to do the outdoor tasks. It is better to work when it is dark." A meticulous system to minimize their exposure was developed by the three sisters. They cultivated a garden in the back of the property, surrounded by tall trees, and raised chickens and goats, animals that, according to them, did not care about appearances. All interactions with the outside world were handled by their brother Thomas, shopping in the city, negotiations, bank affairs. "Elan was the best seamstress I've ever met," said an elderly neighbor in 1992, who had occasionally exchanged eggs for embroidery with the family. "I never saw her face, but her hands created true works of art." A two-story structure with small windows and permanently closed curtains was the Whitaker house, documented in rare photos from the county file. The interior, according to descriptions, was surprisingly organized and clean, with mirrors notably absent. Photographs of distant ancestors from generations prior to the severe deformities were displayed on the living room walls. A detailed diary was kept by Ruth, the youngest sister, partially preserved in the archives of the Missouri Historical Society. In a 1965 entry, she wrote, "Today I observed my reflection in the well water. For a moment, with the dusklight, it almost seemed normal. I dreamed what it would be like to walk around the city without people shouting or driving away." More than simple coverings, the masks became alternative identities. Each sister had several masks for different occasions. Eleanor, the most skilled with a needle and thread, created masks with subtly different expressions, one with a slight smile for special days, another more neutral for everyday life. "The most extraordinary thing," wrote Dr. Lon, "is that even when alone at home, they rarely removed the masks. Margaret explained to me that they had become so accustomed to wearing them that they felt naked without them. That the sisters seemed to have developed an elaborate body language to compensate for their limited facial expression was reported by the few visitors who entered the house, especially Dr. Lon and occasionally the local pastor. Hand gestures, head inclinations, and variations in posture communicated emotions their covered faces could not express. Secondary health problems in addition to the facial deformities are shown by medical records. Eleanor had severe scoliosis, Margaret presented progressive hearing loss, and Ruth suffered from chronic breathing problems, all characteristics consistent with syndromes associated with prolonged consanguinity. If you also feel the weight of this story, comment now. Behind each mask, there is a soul that longs for dignity. The lives of these women remind us that acceptance and compassion are gifts many have never known. Though extraordinary, the story of the Whitaker sisters is not unique. At least 27 family centers in the Americas with similar patterns of genetic isolation and high rates of consanguineous marriages resulting in clusters of severe genetic conditions were identified by research conducted by the Institute of Human Genetics at Johns Hopkins University between 1985 and 1997. In 1976, medical anthropologist Dr. Eduardo documented the case of the veiled women of Mur in an isolated community in the mountains of Chihuahua, Mexico. 5 women from the same extensive family had facial deformities similar to the Whitaker sisters and adopted similar practices of concealment. Dr. Eduardo noted, "The masks have become part of their cultural identity, transforming a need into a tradition." Multiple cases of congenital malformations in communities with high endogamy rates were identified in the Appalachian region by a study of health in isolated communities conducted between 1970 and 1982. The study, controversial at the time for its ethical and social implications, remained partially confidential until 2005. Documented cases in the Melungeon community, an isolated triracial population of the Appalachians, were registered in Hancock County, Tennessee, by rural doctor Dr. William Kennedy in 1963. I found 4 adult women using permanent veils, all from the same family lineage. Local residents respect their privacy, but outsiders often react with cruelty. In Nova Scotia, Canada, the small community of Fishers Harbour was home to the case of the MacDonald sisters, descendants of Scottish settlers who arrived in 1820 and remained extremely isolated. The 3 sisters, born in the 1940s, had severe facial deformities due to multiple generations of marriages between cousins. 7 weddings among first-degree cousins in just 3 generations are confirmed by parish records. The isolation of these communities was not only geographical but also informational. That basic information on genetic risks associated with consanguineous marriages rarely reached these isolated communities was revealed by a review of medical records from the Appalachian region carried out by Dr. Harold Mitchell in 1988. When it did arrive, it was often disregarded as external interference in established traditions. No one told us that marrying cousins could cause problems. It was what everyone did. My parents were cousins. My grandparents were cousins. When my face started to develop differently, everyone thought it was just bad luck, said a woman identified only as Ms. S from an isolated Kentucky community, who also used a mask, in a 1990 interview with the medical journal Frontiers in Genetics. A consistent pattern emerged from these various cases. Conditions for genetic isolation were created by geographical isolation, often reinforced by religious or cultural beliefs that favored marriages within the same community or family. This isolation was deepened by subsequent social stigmatization, creating a cycle that persisted for generations. The more disturbing aspect is not the genetic condition itself, but how the response to these conditions often worsened the suffering of the affected families, observed geneticist Dr. Paul Bergman in 1990, who studied multiple cases. Public health records reveal that in many of these cases, basic medical interventions that could have softened complications were either refused or never offered. Isolation, initially a cause of the conditions, also became an obstacle to treatment. Closed doors, unanswered calls, and occasionally veiled threats are what I found when I tried to document some of these cases in 1988, wrote investigative journalist Michael Harkins. These communities have learned through painful experience that exposure rarely brings benefits and often results in humiliation. Anthropologist Dr. Caroline Fisher, who has studied isolated communities for 3 decades, notes, the use of masks, veils, or other methods of concealment became more than a practical response to physical deformities. In many cases, it evolved into a distinct cultural expression, almost an act of resistance against a world that rejected them. Time did not stand still in the Ork Mountains. In 1987, Eleanor Whitaker passed away at 55 due to respiratory complications, a secondary condition related to her craniofacial malformations. Margaret followed in 1995 at the age of 61. Ruth, the youngest, lived until 2002, dying at 65. The family home, abandoned after the death of Ruth and their brother Thomas in 1998, stood for years as a silent monument to lives lived in the shadows. A fire destroyed the structure in 2008, taking with it the last physical traces of that extraordinary family. Yet, the legacy of the Whitaker sisters and similar women in the Americas persists in unexpected forms. The Craniofacial Anomalies Foundation was established in 1992, partially inspired by the cases documented by Dr. Lon, offering surgical treatment and psychological support for children and adults with severe facial malformations. Cases like the Whitaker sisters show us the human cost of failures in our health systems and social support, commented Dr. Rachel Cohen, a plastic surgeon specializing in facial reconstruction, in 2010. Today, many of these conditions can be treated with relatively simple surgical interventions if identified early. Advances in genetic counseling and prenatal diagnostic techniques mean that many of the conditions that afflicted them can be prevented or treated. However, the social stigma associated with facial deformities persists, albeit in more subtle ways. Surprising insights were offered by the discovery in 1999 of some of the original Whitaker sisters' masks, preserved by a neighbor after Ruth's death. The masks, now part of the permanent collection of the University of Missouri, reveal extraordinary handicraft, made with multiple layers of carefully sewn fabric. Each mask has subtly defined facial characteristics, contours of cheeks, a suggestion of lips, even embroidered eyebrows. These are not simple utilitarian coverings, noted museum curator Dr. Elizabeth Chen. These are attempts to recreate the facial normality that genetics denied them. There is a moving dignity in this effort. The meaning of the masks for her and her sisters was explained by Ruth Whitaker in a rare 1980 interview with Drive LON. People think we use them to hide, and that is partially true. But we also use them to reveal ourselves in the way we choose. When I make a mask, I decide who I will be that day. It is a power that my real face never gave me. Glimpses of a reflective and deeply sensitive woman are offered by Ruth's diary, which covers almost 4 decades of her life. In a 1972 entry, she wrote, "Some people think we live tragic lives, stuck in this house with these faces, but we know joy, too. When Eleanor plays the piano at dusk, when Margaret tells stories that make us laugh to tears, when Thomas returns from the city with a new book to read together. At these times, I forget the masks completely." Due to greater mobility, access to education, and awareness of genetic risks, practices of consanguineous marriage have decreased dramatically in isolated rural communities in recent decades. However, genetic isolation persists as a public health challenge in some remote regions of the Americas. An 87% reduction in marriages between first-degree cousins in U.S. rural areas since 1950 was documented by a study on marriage patterns in isolated communities published in 2018 by the National Institute of Health. However, the same study identified pockets where endogamic practices persist, especially in communities with strong religious or cultural isolation. The lasting power of social stigma and extraordinary human resistance in the face of adversity are what the stories of the women who lived behind masks remind us of. As Ruth Whitaker wrote in her diary in a 1997 entry, "Behind this mask, I have lived a complete life. Limited in some respects, yes, but rich in others. I have known love, beauty, and purpose. What else can anyone ask? If you have watched this far, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, 'I watched here,' so that I can meet you and know who really follows the channel. Don't forget to subscribe to learn more stories like this, stories that reveal forgotten aspects of our shared humanity. Leave your like to support this work of historical documentation and share it with someone who values understanding human experience in all its complexity.